Good morning. Welcome to our webinar. Today is Thursday, November 5th, 2020, 11 o'clock in Arizona. We've just gotten into daylight savings time, so those of you joining from out of state, it may be an hour earlier or an hour later, depending on if you're east or west of us. Today we have Dr. Mary Latta with us. We're going to be going over the Woodbury Fire Ecology Report. These are the Garden and Country Extension webinars at the University of Arizona, Gila County Cooperative Extension. Just a little bit about these webinars. We hold them once a week, every Thursday at 11. It's a Zoom webinar, 60 minutes. Thank you so much for being with us. We cover a variety of horticultural and natural resource topics relevant to the environmental conditions and residential concerns of Gila County. If you live outside of Gila County and these things apply to you, then you are very welcome and thank you for joining us. A recording of this will be posted to our YouTube channel at the University of Arizona Cooperative Extension. So I put these also at the webpage that I have at the county that I manage, but I'll turn this in and these get posted to that YouTube channel first. So you should be able to find it hopefully Monday if you want to get to the recording. So AZ Co-op Extension, if you want to put that into YouTube, it should pop up. And the University of Arizona is an equal opportunity affirmative action institution. Here is our agenda. Thank you for those of you who are able to join us for the login, a little bit of lag time. My name is Chris Jones. I'm your moderator. I'm the Cooperative Extension Agent for Gila County under the University of Arizona. And here in just a moment, Dr. Mary Latta is going to be talking about her Woodbury Fire Ecology Report. When she finishes up, we'll have time for a question and answer discussion with Mary, and we'll wrap up and try to get out of here in time for us in Arizona to go to lunch. I want to make one announcement. We have a special event next week. It's the Cobra Valley Watershed Forum. It is our third annual water forum. And in light of the wildfires that we've had in 2020 around this area that's in southern Gila County, the Globe Miami community, we've made the theme Healthy Forests, Healthy Watersheds. And we'll be talking a lot about the wildland-urban interface and how fire is having an impact on the watershed. And I'm really pleased to share with you that Dr. Mary Latta is our keynote speaker. So if you want to hear from her again, please go to this little website here at the wrrc.arizona.edu, Cobra Valley Water 2020, get registered and please join us. So leading into that, Mary Latta is the fire ecologist at the USDA Forest Service Tonto National Forest. And with that, Mary, I'm going to hand it off to you. And you can take over the share screen, get your slides up. We are up to 26 participants, and we may get some more on here. So thank you everybody for joining us.
Okay, and are you seeing the first slide here now?
Yes, looks like we're set to go.
Excellent. Okay, I'm going to dig right in then. Thank you for the invitation, Chris. Is asking a fire ecologist to come and talk about fire ecology kind of a dangerous thing because we're paid to go on and on and on about it. So I promise we will talk a bit about the, oops, it's not forwarding, let's see. Definitely be talking about fire ecology. I promise not to drone on and on a lot. Trying to narrow it down though, if you ask somebody to talk about fire ecology and you have them narrow it down, it can get a little scary since he didn't get specific about any of these items. I'll just pick them because otherwise it can be just a little bit overwhelming. So what I'm planning on talking about today in regards to the Woodbury fire in the area that burned, we're going to talk a bit about the invasive grasses. That is what is driving some of these awful fires that we're getting and doing the damage to the desert and changing the desert to a different kind of system. Then we're going to talk also about three key components of fire regimes. The frequency, that of course is how often an area burns. And it refers also to the period of time between fires. Fire severity, which is reference to the fire effects. It's not the intensity of the fire, it's what happened when the fire burned through, and it can be either long-term or short-term. And then patch size. Since I started working on the Tonto, I've become much more focused on the importance of patch size, and you'll see that later in this presentation and why it really matters. One easy way to look at it would be to think about if you're a caterpillar and you're trying to cross a road, that road is going to seem really huge. It's a huge patch. But of course, if you're bigger, that patch size is going to seem very different. So looking at scale and patch size, it's pretty important to managing these ecosystems that we look at. So in terms of frequency, first of all, how do we know there was fire on this landscape? Do we know there should be fire in this landscape? What you're going to see here are 10 years worth of lightning strikes broken out by month for the Tonto National Forest. So you can see these little tiny red dots. This current map is December, and there aren't a whole lot of them. There's a little bit. This yellow circle here represents where the Woodbury Fire burned. So if we move on to February, see a little bit of an increase, maybe some early spring storms. March, still some scattered stuff, mostly higher elevations. In April, we're starting to see a little more low elevation, but these are still, it's just not widespread. May is going to be, again, those scattered storms, but it's still mostly high elevations. And as we move into June, take a look up here. This is the Mogollon Rim. The northern boundary of the Tonto National Forest here is the top of the Mogollon Rim. So this area immediately south of it, kind of this fringe in here, is a steep slope. And as the storms move through and move up in elevation, they kick out a lot of lightning up here. So moving into June, we're starting to see the beginning here of monsoon, mostly higher elevations. And so we see a little bit of clusters happening here in Sierra Anchas and up here in the north part of the Cherry Creek area. And then boom, full on monsoon here. So remember, each dot is an individual lightning strike over a 10-year period. If you look down at the Woodbury Fire area, you can see some areas that are just solid red over a period of 10 years. And then we move into August and monsoons backing off a little bit. It's still mostly focused at the higher elevations. And then September and going on into fall and winter, it backs off again. So how does this translate into fires? How do we know those things are going to burn?
I'm going to
Yes.
I'm going to interrupt just for a second. Would you turn off your camera? There's just seems to be a real delay, and that'll give more room in the bandwidth for your slides. So down in that left-hand corner, you can just turn off the video.
Don't see it. Not seeing anything in the left-hand corner. Stop video.
Stop video. Yeah, just click that, stop video. Perfect. Okay, let's see how that works now. I apologize.
Okay. All right, I'll kick back a little bit here. See if that works. So that was December. And so you should be now looking at a more simplified map that shows the boundary of the Tonto National Forest with the wilderness areas in it. Each individual lightning bolt here that you see represents a fire that we responded to. It might have been a helicopter that went out to check out a smoke in the wilderness somewhere that turned out just to be a snag, or one of these single lightning strikes could also have been the bushfire, representing a large area. So you can see the pattern here pretty clearly already. Here's the Mogollon Rim, these upper elevations, the Sierra Anchas down here, south of Globe down over on the bottom right. There's the Pinals. I'm kind of surprised there's not a little bit more here in the superstitions, but I'll talk about that in a second. And then moving through Four Peaks, Mount Ord, and the Mazatzals. It's a pretty clear pattern. So that is the natural fire lightning regime in terms of where we get these fires over 47 years. Here's the human fire regime. Kind of striking in my mind always. I imagine the human lightning, or excuse me, the human fire pattern is quite different now than it might have been several hundred years ago. But what shows up obviously down here in the bottom, this is Highway 60, and you see it go all the way up through the thumb of the Tonto, and then Highway 188 comes along here through Tonto Basin. Starting down here near Fountain Hills, there's Highway 87 going up to Payson, and Highway 260 and the Control Road. So Human patterns are pretty clear, but overall, we know there's a lot of lightning on these landscapes. So zooming in a little bit closer, this is the Woodbury Fire perimeter in yellow. It's approximately 123,000 acres. The light gray outline is the superstition wilderness. This is the same data set, but a little more zoomed in. So the red lightning bolts represent human starts, and the blue represent lightning starts. And again, these are fires that somebody responded to. We are really good about recording point data whenever we respond to a fire, so we know where it was. We don't collect perimeter data on fires unless they are 10 acres or greater. So when we look at that data set, and remember this goes through and including only 2017, I think we are missing a lot of fires in the center part here. This is mostly upper elevation area in the superstition wilderness. And the vegetation types within here are such that they should burn more frequently. So part of the work that I'm doing this winter is working with our GIS folks and some of our fire folks to see if we can find some fires and fill this in a little bit. We see evidence out there in some places that there were fires that we don't have on here. But overall, you can see that there are scattered fires for 47 years. That 47 years includes periods of time when we were pretty successful at suppressing a lot of fires. Looking at the vegetation, I'm going to go back and forth just a second. This yellow represents semi-desert grasslands. Those are systems that would have frequent high severity fire. So high severity meaning that over 75% of the above ground biomass would be consumed by the fire. And for a grassland, that's a good thing most of the time. It cuts back on the woody encroachment and it rejuvenates some of the dead grass, previous year's grass. The purple in this map represents desert. For the most part, deserts are not adapted to fire, not the deserts we have, not the Sonoran Desert. So much of it burns every year already that I consider any acre now that burns in the desert to be detrimental. The orange is chaparral, and the brown is something we call pinyon juniper shrub. These are both systems that are adapted to infrequent high severity fire. The main difference in the fire patterns between the two is the patch size. In the chaparral, we're fine with 2,000 acre patches. We had one that was almost 3 in the Woodbury Fire. That's probably okay given how long it's been since these areas have burned. But the brown patch size is much smaller there, or should be much smaller. And we had some patches in the Woodbury Fire up there that were almost 5,000 acres. So that will be detrimental for a number of reasons. We won't have time to go into all of these details. Very briefly, this juniper grass, light green over here, is a savanna system that also burned a little hotter than we would have liked it to. And one that I hope we have time to talk about is this darker green in the middle. That's the Ponderosa pine evergreen oak that's up high. So real quick, if you look back here, remember this area here was grassland, should be frequent fire. We've only had 2 little fires in there in the last 47 years that we've documented, and that's just kind of an issue. So overall, here's the breakdown on the vegetation types. We're calling them ecological response units within the Woodbury Fire. The biggest one, of course, was the Mojave Desert, Sonoran Desert. 51,000 acres, so 40% of the footprint of this fire was within that, and I consider all of that to have been detrimental to the health of the system. On the flip side of that is the semi-desert grassland, which was 26% of the area, about 33,000 acres. Pretty much all of that would be beneficial, knocking back woody encroachment, rejuvenating some of the area in terms of decadent plants. And then the third biggest area is the PJ evergreen shrub. So infrequent fire with high severity, but smaller patches on the order of 200 to 300 acres, I believe. What's striking to me is, if you remember the map, I'm not going to take the time to go back, but the way they're kind of intermixed, and yet they're very, very, very different in their adaptations to fire. The purple, the desert, not adapted. The PJ evergreen shrub adapted to infrequent higher severity, and the semi-desert grassland adapted to frequent high severity. And yet they're all intermixed up there, which I find fascinating. So for this next little chunk, I'm going to be talking about the setup for the Woodbury Fire, why it spread as it did in the desert, and this will also apply to the bushfire. I haven't had time to bring in a lot of that data set yet, but hopefully I will in the future here. So for the most part, it's all about precipitation. If the precipitation changes from what the area is adapted to, then you're going to see differences. These are data from the Tonto Basin RAS station. As you see there, this is only covering 2009 to 2017, and that's a relatively short period to be calling it an average. But my choice was to use a RAS station, that's Remote Automated Weather Station, from a location that was relevant to both the Bush and the Woodbury fires, or to find something farther away that might be even more departed. So I chose to go with that, that weather station and look at that average. It's pretty close based on what we all know the normals are for this area. So looking at the purple, the normal pattern, in September you get a little bit of rain, a little bit more over the winter often, and then it slowly drips off and becomes practically nothing in the summer. So that's repeated the same pattern over here because it's an average by the month. Average in September is a little over 1 inch, so average here also in September a little over 1 inch. The yellow is what was actually recorded at the RAS station for precipitation. So in October of 2018, there were just shy of 3 inches. So that's a little over twice as much as would have been typical and normal in that area. A lot of the invasive species and some of the native desert ephemeral species start to grow in the fall. It depends on the availability of precipitation and to a slightly lesser degree on the temperature. So October would have gotten some things started. By late October, you probably were already seeing germination of some of the grasses in particular. Then you had 3 fairly dry months, November, December, January. And then we had this big event in February, which many of you will remember, even down in the desert, it looked like this. So as low as 2,300 feet, there were 2 or 3 inches of snow. There's a lot of variability within that as well. There were some areas lower down that got a little more and some areas higher up that got less, like there always are. But there's a big difference between the effects of snow as precipitation and of liquid water as vegetation. You think of, if you get 2 inches of rain in an hour, most of that's going to just wash off. It'll wet things pretty good, but then it dries off and it goes away really fast. A lot of it just runs off the surface. If that same 2 inches takes 2 days to come down, there's a lot more time for things to absorb. It comes down slower, and that's very similar to what happens with snow. As it melts, even if it melts quickly for snow, it's not nearly as fast as it would be if this came down quickly as rain. So this is going to send moisture down much farther into the soil, and maybe even do a little recharge of some of the subsurface water areas, and make that water available for a longer period of time for things that are deep-rooted. So that was February. We had that snow, and then we had a pretty wet March as well, although nothing compared with February. 1 month of kind of dry in April isn't going to hurt anything used to the desert, but that got to where the crop of invasive grasses was able to dry out by the end of May, and then we had the Woodbury Fire start on June 8th. So that was the setup for the fire year for 2018-2019. Then we had the monsoon. So remember, the purple is the average precipitation by month. We were pretty low in July and way low in August. And then in September, it just wouldn't stop raining. And then it completely stopped raining in October. But then if you look here on the left side, look at the precipitation pattern overall from September through March. It was wet, and there were a couple of pretty good events, but there were also 3 pretty dry months in a row. If you look at that same period, September through March 2019 to 2020, not only was there even more precipitation than the previous years, but it was much more continuous. So as we go through here, there was rain. It seemed to me it was almost every other week we'd get a rainstorm. So by the time the bushfire started on June 13th, we were off to the races, and there was a lot of fuel out there. I'm going to talk a little bit here about the grasses. This is my least favorite one, although it's beautiful when it's fully seeded out. This is red brome, Bromus rubens. On the Tonto, this is currently our biggest headache in the desert areas in particular. Each seed head produces about 75 seeds. And you can have up to 1,000 individual plants in 1 square meter, so 75,000 seeds in 1 square meter. And let's say that's okay, we can have up to that, but maybe it's more typical to have half of that. That's still an awful lot of seeds. And these seeds are not going to be phased by, even if they're off of the plant, by laying on the hot, dry soil throughout a Sonoran Desert summer. They're fine with that. Up to 100 or 1,500 of these seeds, that's 2%, can remain viable for up to 2 years. So it's a pretty tough plant overall. And unlike cheatgrass, we see red brome going into areas that are not disturbed. That is more disturbing to me than anything, because it means that really none of the Sonoran Desert is safe. And when I talk to my colleagues who work across the forest, nobody can point me anywhere where there's any extensive area of Sonoran Desert that doesn't have a problem with red brome. This is one of the biggest problems we're seeing these last 2 years. The viability of a seed doesn't really start to drop until about 6 months after it's finally become viable on the plant. So if it becomes viable as early as March, April, May, June, July, August, September, we get rains in September, October, November, most of the seed is still going to be viable. So we've got these huge crops. This is an area in Tonto Basin that burned in the Woodbury Fire. This is what it looked like in December last year. What you're seeing is a lot of red brome coming in, especially under the shrubs. You've got some individual schismus, we'll talk about this in a second, schismus plants coming up out in the open areas here. So it's already starting and well on its way by December. This is what it looked like in the areas that did not burn. So this was what it looked like in a lot of the bushfire area in December. You had last year's thatch and litter from the red brome that burned, or that grew the previous year and didn't burn. In addition to, now you have this really productive crop of seeds from 2019 that is now germinating to set us up in 2020. This is a range photo point down in Tonto Basin from 2011. This is a more typical distribution of the herbaceous surface fuels. Think about what happens if you drop a match in there. Probably wouldn't go very far, even if you managed to torch out a shrub or two. This is what it looked like in April of 2019. And we don't have this for 2020, but the estimates by some folks at Missoula that have been modeling herbaceous surface vegetation, and this then was confirmed by those of us on the ground that it was probably pretty accurate, said that we had about 3 times this much in 2020. So when you cure this out, you can imagine what this is going to burn like. This particular photo was taken 2 or 3 days into the Woodbury Fire, about 2 miles from where it started. So this is what the fuels were looking like in a lot of the area right where Woodbury Fire started. And I'm sure your imagination can show you what that looked like. So that's just the red brome. This next species I won't spend quite as much time on, but it's just as guilty as the others, although the behavior, fire behavior isn't quite as extreme. We have 2 or 3 species of schismus in this area, commonly called Mediterranean grass. I'm sure there's a million other common names. This grows in areas where vegetative cover has been reduced. The place that I see it the most is in some of the flat areas, say in Tonto Basin or down on the Mesa District as well, where there's been grazing, off-road vehicle use, construction, picnic grounds, things like that, where the vegetation that would have been there has been reduced. As with red brome, it starts germinating in the fall and early winter. This one is a little more aggressive on reproduction though. Usually it matures roughly in March, but you can get a second phase of germination after monsoon. If it produces seeds, they're then viable March, April, May, June, then we get monsoon and it can start all over again that early. And it can produce seed as quickly as in 2 weeks if ideal temperature and moisture occurs. And once it's germinated, it's fine if things dry up for a while. So this is a pretty tough species as well. We have this interaction going on between those 2 species that I've only really personally recognized in the last year or so, and I'm going to keep an eye on it. And if anybody wants to know more or look into this more, I'd be interested in talking to you. So this is down in Tonto Basin. MSDS is the Mojave-Sonoran Desert scrub. This is about 2 hours before the Woodbury Fire burned through this area. So take note over here, there's a little bit of woody stuff, and over here there's some woody fuels as well. Look closely down in here though. This is the schismus, and you can see it's not a very heavy fuel. It's contiguous, so the fire certainly can scoot along through this stuff, but there's not enough fuel and it's all very light fuel. So the heat that it produces is not going to be super high, even if it burns as intensely as it can. the residence time is going to be short, so there won't be a lot of heat that can go down. So that was June 21st. This is June 22nd, despite saying that it's June the 2nd. And you can tell by the pattern and by the lack of consumption in this area anyway, of the shrubs, that this was a pretty low severity fire, and there wasn't a lot of heat between the shrubs, certainly. There's two little piles of white ash where there was some woody fuels that had a little bit higher heat load, but for the most part, there wasn't much heat going in there. This is what it looked like by September. Monsoons had come and either washed away the char and the ash or allowed it to become absorbed into the system. And yet, last April, it was dominated by red brome. So that's that effect of why it's important that the viability of the species is one of the things we look at when we're trying to figure out what to do with an area. Burning it may help, but you have to keep at it so that you continually burn up the seed source, and we just can't do that. So then overall, then this bottom right photo was last week, basically. So first year prior to the fire, dominated by schismus. A year later, dominated by red brome. I'm not sure what that cycle is going to lead to. The native species have a very similar pattern in that there are a lot of them that we consider ephemeral species. They have long-lived seed banks, so they don't produce tons of seed and try and get them to germinate all at once like those grasses do. They don't produce as many seeds, but those seeds are going to live for a long time in the seed bank, and then they will germinate when there's sufficient moisture. That's part of the competition that is sometimes losing out to the red brome and the schismus. Some of them are pretty effective. So this is Castanea excerta. It's a first cousin for Indian paintbrush and commonly called owl clover, I think. And you can see a little bit of red brome in there, but this is an area that burned completely. The grass did in the Woodbury Fire. This was an area that had schismus in it, so not a lot of heat went down. Obviously, it didn't damage the seed bed at all. It was pretty striking last year when we had the moisture. My curiosity about this had me going down there to look at it. This, I think, was in April, and then again in May. I wanted to get a handle on what do the natural species look like when they're in a condition that they could actually carry fire. Historically, these areas did burn once in a while, but on a really long, for the most part, like 200 years or more. But this is what it would have looked like. You can see if you look close, there's a little bit of Plantago patagonica as well as that owl clover. It's not a thick, heavy fuel, but it would carry fire with like a 5 or 10 mile an hour wind. And that would allow fire to scoot around. And you can see that little shadow of red brome ominously in the background. So we're going to talk about severity for just a little bit and then move on to some different vegetation types. And Chris, keep me straight on time. I didn't start my top watch on time. So this is a map of the soil burn severity for the Woodbury Fire. And you can see there's not a lot of high severity. This is up high in the Superstition Wilderness. Some of this area is where we have Ponderosa pine. Some of it is where we have the pinyon juniper evergreen shrub. Those are the two main types where we saw these high severity, and a little bit of it's where we had chaparral. When you're talking to somebody or listening to somebody and they're talking about the severity of a fire, it's important to understand if they're talking about burn severity or if they're talking about vegetation severity. They're both really important to consider and to be aware of, but they represent very different things. So where you're going to have high severities to the soil, you are absolutely going to have even more high severity in that area to the vegetation. And if you remember, which would be pretty impressive if you did, this area up here is actually grasslands, mostly semi-desert grasslands up here. And so that high severity up there is a good thing. That's what the system needed. And it's mostly light fuels. So if you look at what the soil shows in that area, it's mostly low severity because, again, those are grass fuels. They just don't put down a lot of heat. So we're going to have, whatever time we have left, we'll be able to talk mostly about a couple of different vegetation types. Riparian systems have an inordinate importance to the landscape, particularly in the Southwest. They play a critical role for wildlife, for diversity, for the hydrology of these areas that are often, well, I'm not going to say they don't have enough water. They are what they are because of that. But for that reason, the water areas are precious. And of course, we humans tend to go to water. This is the Rivas Ranch area right here. These areas are also very much affected by the areas adjacent to them. A lot of folks think they should never burn, but I think the case is that they burn less frequently than the areas around them. So in this case, you have the juniper grass. This is a savanna system mostly around it and some grassland areas. So frequent fire. That tells me that fire would have gotten into these riparian areas not quite as frequently as the adjacent systems, but it would have gotten in there periodically, probably burned with low to mixed severity most of the time. They're also, these riparian areas, affected by what happens upslope. So in the bottom left corner, you can see some pretty high severity. The more the contiguous areas of high severity upslope from these riparian areas, the more they're going to get sediment and excessive overland flow and such into them. For those of you who might have driven on State Route 88, also known as the Apache Trail, that's the bottom part of this photo on the left. You can only walk there now and some of the road's still intact. I was there last week. As far as the riparian system, it's pretty cool. I forgot to put the photo in, but the regeneration of the cottonwood down there is just phenomenal. It's incredible because that's what it's used to. So overall, you're going to see this map for a couple of different veg types. The dark gray shows where there was high severity to the vegetation. The light gray, such as you see up here in the northern part here, is where there was moderate vegetation severity. And of course, the other is where there's none. These little striped areas are where there were clouds, and the imagery we used for these data were not available. So there's some areas that were unfortunate. This area down here is the headwater of Campaign Creek. That was also a habitat for, I believe it was Gila top minnow. And there also are some areas just up the hill here for the Arizona hedgehog cactus. Some other high severity areas here. Down over here in Rogers Canyon. Overall, there was more high severity definitely in the riparian areas than really was a good idea, was healthy for the system. This is what the numbers looked like. So we had 20% of the riparian area burned with high severity. I would say all of that was definitely detrimental. Some of the moderate would also have been pretty detrimental depending on the continuity of it. So that's where that patch size comes in. Ideal patch size in this case depends a little bit on the veg type, but for the most part in riparian areas, you don't want to see a lot of contiguous high severity. This was one area where prior to the fire burning through it, I thought I would set up a photo point and get a sense of how the riparian area changed prior to, pre and post fire. So this was the day before, and this is in Tonto National Monument, maybe a quarter mile up from the visitor center there. That was the 21st. This is the 22nd. You can see a little white ash in the background and over to the left here, but doesn't show huge change. This was September when things had a chance to fall over and brown out a little. You can see it's a lot more open. And some of the area that just had white ash and litter on it, that's now washed away. This is what it looked like in June this last year. So overall, this particular location and stretch of riparian came through just fine. It did a little bit of shaking things up, and I don't think this would have been terribly detrimental, although I know there were areas that were pretty bad. Desert willow is one of my very favorite Sonoran Desert species. And I didn't get any pre-post where it burned. I did get this interesting photo. This is along the Apache Trail, State Route 88. And this is just to the south of it where the fire did not burn, but it's only maybe 150 feet behind me when I'm taking this picture is the State Route 88, and the fire was on the other side of it. So you can see a lot of erosion, a lot of sediment movement here. So this was December last year. And this is what it looked like last week. I'll go back and forth a couple of times. I was pretty amazed at how stable it looked overall. You can see the sediment moving around, but the vegetation is only moderately changed right in this area. Again, this didn't burn. This is just looking at the effects of the increased flow in that area. How am I doing on time, Chris?
You're doing fine. This is all very interesting. So keep on going.
Okay. So looking at the Mojave-Sonoran Desert shrub, I'm going to hold this photo for just a second. What you'll notice is there is not a lot of invasive grass on this particular slope. In my opinion, the Sonoran Desert, as we knew it, is probably an extinct system at this point because of the grasses. It doesn't mean we're going to lose all the species by any means. What you're looking at here is a South Rocky slope where those invasive grasses simply can't take hold. And for that reason, it's not going to burn much either. So I think we'll just see species, for the most part, kind of rearrange themselves. And the system still has to come to an equilibrium with what's happening to it because of the grasses. So overall, high severity, moderate severity, and in my mind, even low severity is detrimental for Mojave-Sonoran Desert scrub. That's represented here, obviously, by the purple. Again, the dark gray is high severity, the light gray is moderate, and that's an awful lot of it that was within the Woodbury Fire. What's really unfortunate, too, is in this area that is not Mojave-Sonoran Desert scrub, there are a lot of beneficial fire effects in this area. But as far as the Woodbury Fire, they really aren't visible unless you're into hiking quite a ways, because a lot of this was within the superstition wilderness. Most of what people see of the Woodbury Fire is in the Sonoran Desert, and they see the destructive power of the fire in that system. Overall, we had about 51,000 acres where most of the effects were not positive. If I were to count high, moderate, and low as detrimental, then 85% of this area that burned was badly damaged by the Woodbury Fire. So in a historically healthy system in this Mojave-Sonoran Desert scrub, in the Sonoran Desert, the vegetation is pretty shrubby, and when a clump of vegetation burns, you probably could get some pretty good flame lights out of it. But that would have been mostly, say, from a lightning fire, and it would have been pretty small because in these areas that you can see are light tan here, there wouldn't have been any vegetation. And so fire would have had a hard time spreading except in those really wet years. And even then, the native vegetation wasn't as dense or as thick. So this is how the fire is burning now. This is actually the bushfire. And you can see, as you zoom in a little bit, that it is the grasses that are carrying it. In any fire system, the main carrier of the fire is always going to be the fine fuels. If you're talking about a crown fire and lodgepole pine, it's the needles and the fine and the smaller twigs that are carrying the fire, starting that initial flamage in the crowns and letting it carry to the next piece of fuel. In this case, you can see it's clearly the grasses that are allowing the fire to back. The fact that the fire can back through this stuff with an almost contiguous fire is one of the big problems we have with this system right now. So there's another side of fire, which I hadn't seen close up until this year in the Sonoran Desert. This is downtown base. This was the next day. So fuels were very similar conditions, and it was just a matter of the alignment of slope and wind. Much more extreme behavior, as you can see. Is this natural? Did it ever burn like this? Maybe once in a while. As far as my experience with the desert, the folks I've talked to, I don't know if you can hear that. I always narrate these things on fires. This area was being initiated by the red brown, again, much heavier, fine surface fuels. It was a pretty fancy bit of firefighting, very impressive on the part of, give a shout out to Will Balcom and his Strikers Task Force of Engines did an amazing job. So unfortunately, this is what more and more the Sonoran Desert is looking like and will continue to. So unless we can come up with a control, an effective control for our 800,000 acres that the Tonto manages, an effective control for these invasive grasses, I don't really see how it's not going to turn into this. We're going to have wet years more often than every 35 years. So in effect, these systems are now frequent firegrass shrub systems in regards to how they burn their fire regimes, their current fire regimes. Chris, you probably have to cut me off at some point. So give me a heads up when you do. Hopefully I can get through a little bit of these next two. I'm going to talk a little bit about Ponderosa pine, evergreen oak, and chaparral and their interactions, and try and do it quickly so there's time for some discussion. I have questions for you guys as well. So the Ponderosa pine evergreen oak ecological response unit is different than the Ponderosa pine that you find higher up. Up on the Mogollon Rim, your primary sprouting woody species are gamble oak and robinia, New Mexican locust. There are others, but those are the two biggies. And down on the Tonto, when we get just a little bit below the Mogollon Rim, you have manzanitas, you have ceanothus, you have multiple species of oak, all of which sprout like crazy once you burn them. This particular picture is up in the superstitions. It shows you some of the Ponderosa pine up there. And that's probably not too far off of what a lot of it always looked like. On some things we saw on the pine fire up on the Prescott a little earlier this year. But overall, we have a lot of encroachment of these sprouting woody species. Once you get, whether it's turbanella oak or white oak or any of these sprouting species, once they establish in an area, it's really hard to kill them with one fire. We have a hard time getting fire into an area just once. And the problem is those species, which I'm going to kind of refer to as the Chaparral faction of the shrubs, woody shrubs, they sprout a lot. They provide potential for much greater fire behavior underneath the pines. And that's a headache we've had for a while that we're not really sure of. So this is one part of some healthy Ponderosa pine, evergreen oak. This is up in the Pinals. Unfortunately, the grass in the foreground is weeping love grass. It's an invasive. Yet another one that we're not going to spend time on today. But you can see, in this case, they're pretty young Ponderosa pine, but there's a good mix of oak and juniper in with the Ponderosa pine, as you see here as well. As far as the Woodbury Fire goes, there was not a lot of Ponderosa pine, of the Ponderosa pine evergreen oak. And what there was hasn't had a lot of good fire for a long time, so it had an awful lot of those shrubby things under it. And so, as you can see, we lost a fair amount of the pine up there. That pine is a bit of a remnant up there. It's on the bottom end of its range, and so a lot of it tries to cling to cold air drainages where it can have conditions that it can thrive in. But it interfaces with frequent fire or infrequent high severity fire systems. I'll talk more about that in a second. So this is, we only had about 1,700 acres. And this is showing you that overall vegetation severity was about 44%. Most of that was in big blobs, and so that's not good. The moderate severity and the low and very low, that's all really good stuff up there. So for some of this pine, it's in much better shape now than it was, but unfortunately for a big chunk of it, we lost some pine up there. Going back, sorry, size here is important. This particular pine type in particular would have had a little more high severity than the Ponderosa pine up on the rim. And I think you can make a case for it being even more dependent on fire than the Ponderosa pine up higher on the rim because of what happens with these sprouting woody species when they move into an area. So this is what we all think of as pretty classic Ponderosa pine fire behavior. This is a backfire. It's just heating up the litter and the cones. It might torch a tree here and there or a group of trees here and there. In the Ponderosa pine evergreen oak, it's also going to top kill a lot of sprouting wood species, and that is important. So without letting this go too far, quick plug for smoke. I won't go into it. Smoke has a lot of beneficial effects on the landscape, just not to humans. There's a little teaser for the next time. So here's one of the things we see with Ponderosa pine when we start to get on the lower elevational side of its range. You get these really sharp changes in vegetation. So this is up in the superstitions during the Woodbury Fire. This is about the only picture I have of it actually burning. But this is the difference between the north slope and the south slope. It's a pretty sharp difference in vegetation, as you can see. And can't go into all of these. So this is what I wanted to talk about a little bit. A lot of this south slope, not all of it. You can see there's some pines in there that are gone now, but a lot of this would have been more the Ponderosa pine evergreen shrub or chaparral type vegetation. Vegetation that burns really hot or it doesn't burn at all. It burns with high severity, not very frequently. The Ponderosa pine has been encroaching into that. And Ponderosa pine increases the flammability of what's under it because it wants to burn. And pine needles, Ponderosa pine needles are like gasoline. So you get needle drape. as these needles get stuck on the shrubs as they start to fall from the tree, and it makes these shrubs more and more flammable. So where the pines start to encroach into the shrubs, you start to get more needle growth. Where the shrubs are encroaching into the pine, you get potential for more high flame lengths, for more intense fire coming from the surface, and that can kill the pines. So that interface, or the ecotone between those kind of systems and between the pine, and what I'm seeing, it looks to me like it's broadening. So that area, that ecotone is going to be more flammable and have potential to produce some more extreme fire behavior than if you're right out in the chaparral, maybe isn't quite as flammable, but the fire behavior can be pretty impressive. And the typical fire behavior in the Ponderosa pine wouldn't be as extreme as you'd see in the chaparral, but it's going to be more flammable because it wants to burn more often with those needles and grass on the ground. So in this case, we would have seen, if we'd been there to watch, the fire ran up the hill, got to this interface area, torched it out. So we lost big chunks of Ponderosa pine. That happened in the bushfire too, but I haven't run those numbers to see over how much are bad. I'll go through this last one really quick. So this is chaparral real quick. That shows what a fire line looks like when you try and put it in. Sometimes it's effective, sometimes it's not, but it has to be really broad. This is the north side of the peaks. This one kind of breaks my heart, but in terms of how that burned right there, what impressed me on this photo was the continuity of the gray. This is the chaparral burning, and it burned super hot when it burned right there. So even though this is 3 days, I think, after it burned, you can still see that gray color, and it stood out from quite a distance on the front side of the 4 peaks. So almost done here. Ideal patch size, less than 2,100 acres. There's always a little of this and a little of that, and give a little bit. I didn't have a lot of problems with the way the chaparral burned. I think for the chaparral and the Woodbury fire, it was beneficial. Here's how it likes to burn. You see those detached flame lengths. So a flame is what you get. Start heating up a piece of fuel, and the materials that fuel is made out of start to turn into flammable gases. And as part of that, you get these tiny little particulates that are actually going to turn red hot and burn. And so what you're looking at with a flame is an envelope of these gases, and it's oxidizing from the outside in as those fine little black, tiny little particulates burn. And where you can see it sort of throwing off, whipping out detached flame lengths, it cools off, and you can see those unburned particles that get thrown off as part of the smoke. I could watch fire behavior stuff today, but we need to move on. I know I'm running late here. So I think I'm going to move right on just briefly in terms of some of the challenges for the Tonto. This is an area up in the Sierra Anchas. I think it was the picture fire, might have been Mistake Peak. Big area of high severity in what I'm going to say what used to be Ponderosa pine. So we have these areas that can still produce cones, refugia, and these are super important to these areas recovering. But you can imagine what would happen, picture it based on what you've just seen. If we get a fire in here on a hot, windy day, is that still going to be intact? I don't know. This used to be one of my favorite views on the Tonto, coming up Highway 87 in the Mesa District. Looks quite different now. We also have a big influence from recreationists, folks who just want to come out and either play on the landscape, hiking, UTVs, boats, picnicking, just to look at the beautiful landscapes. And this is a challenge to maintain these days. Habitat is an issue as well. We put people at risk, in this case on the juniper fire, in order to try and minimize fire effects to spotted owl habitat. We burn this out at night. So that means putting firefighters out in the woods at night, trying to get areas to burn out with lower severity. So almost done here. This is just a litany of questions that we've come up with. We being people I've talked to who work for the Forest Service, cooperators, publics, my family, other folks. We don't have answers to these. And these are some questions, if you have answers, I'd sure appreciate it if you could give them to us. So that said, it's time for questions. I'm going to go back to that other screen and hope that you guys can answer these questions for me.
Thank you, Mary. go ahead and turn your camera back on. And if you want to show those questions, we'll need to bring them back up. But we can have our camera on and we can have those questions at the same, your slides up if you want to have those up.
Let's see if folks want to see them.
We were having some bandwidth problems, and so some of the pictures were lagging, but the content that you had for us was just so fascinating. No, we didn't lose anybody. We all hung on.
Oh, good. I'm afraid I know I went long. I apologize for that.
Okay. Michael Chamberlain has a quick question here as part of the definition of Mojave-Sonoran Desert scrub. And then I'm going to bring up Michael, who's got something a little more depth for us here.
Okay. So here this is the ecological, let me get this, there it is. Ecological response units. It's a classification system that our region has come up with, the region of the Forest Service. If you're interested, if you send me an email after this, I can send a copy of this to you. It classifies our vegetation on a fairly coarse scale based on what could grow there, what does grow there, the soil type, the disturbance regimes, and it gives some pretty gory details. It's relatively new, the last few years, but our regional office is pretty outstanding about constantly wanting to upgrade it. They're going to come up with an update this spring, I believe, for this first version, but they've been really useful for us in helping to understand these systems. That's not a direct question, but it will lead you directly to a detailed answer.
Well, thank you. And I brought up Michael Burgoyne. And if Michael, can we hear you? You can go ahead and.
Yes, can you guys hear me?
You're good to go.
Awesome. Yeah, wow, I was so excited when I saw this webinar because I've been back home in Arizona now for the last, since the beginning, or since last Christmas, and then the pandemic hit. And right at the beginning of the pandemic, I was going to contact U of A because I've been studying regenerative agriculture, and especially now dealing with arid agriculture. And I've realized over the years that this is so connected to wildfire prevention because of the study of the forests and forestry. And so I have been, I'm sorry, that was a little unexpected, but yeah, so I'm like writing my question right now. And
feel free to ask it.
yeah, well, this is, I feel like I have a better understanding of fire prevention because it's my entire life I've always thought thinning out the forest was the answer. And my best friend was one of the 19 firefighters who passed away in the Prescott fire, or the Yarnell fire. And I always thought, yeah, thinning out the forest was the right idea, but now I've been studying soil health, and it actually is the opposite thing in my studies, and that we should actually be like managing the forests and like pruning and chopping and dropping and being very more observant to the ecology of the environment, not just extracting all of the carbon. When we thin out the forest, we're actually opening up the canopy in the forest. And so in my opinion, like now this is just like, this has been huge for me the last 2 years because, I've had a very intimate relationship with wildfires, and because, my best friend and also 4 of my classmates were, in the 19 firefighters. And so I feel like it's kind of like, it's always been on my mind, and so I really loved all the information you told us today. And I guess I just want to know what you think about maybe like mulching, and like when we, like managing the forest would be like to prune all the dead stuff and then possibly wood chip it and compost it and apply it back to the soil in order to give health, and protection to the trees instead of cutting down the trees.
Okay, Michael, thank you. Mary, can you give him a response to that? And thank you for sharing all that. There's so much new things to learn, and
Yeah.
really interesting. Go ahead.
Michael, I would encourage you to go online. One of the things you could look up where there'd be a lot of terrific information would be the Forest Restoration Initiative. I worked for that for 8 years prior to moving to the Tonto. So as far as the work to be done, the Forest Restoration Initiative, I'll say, I think it's 7 syllables and call it FORFRI. That was considering 2.4 million acres of Ponderosa pine between the south rim of the Grand Canyon and the New Mexican border that really, really needed to have something done. It had so much undergrowth, overgrowth. The forest was very unhealthy and extremely at extreme risk of high severity fire, which, as you pointed out, is going to do a number on the soil as well. So there's a huge cost to doing mechanical treatments, and getting prescribed fire on the ground can be very tricky. Lots and lots and lots and lots and lots of hoops to jump through. Sometimes we're successful in being able to use a wildfire to get the work done for us. Sometimes we simply can't put them out, as was the case with Bush and Woodbury. We didn't really want either of those to burn, but once they got started, that's a whole nother issue I won't get into right now unless you have a question on it. So generally, the most effective, fastest way to move a Ponderosa pine forest towards being healthy is to use a combination of fire and mechanical, but it's expensive. And one of the complications we have with the Ponderosa pine, evergreen oak, that is not there for some of the upper elevation Ponderosa pine is that if we open it up too much, I can't remember, our local silviculturist knows these numbers and I can't remember it. I think it's roughly 40%. If we open it up much more than 40%, then the shrubs start to really move in and it makes the problem worse unless we could keep fire on the ground, at least I would say every 5 years for 2 or 3 cycles, and then you could back off a little bit. It's a tough call and we have not got it solved yet.
The world is changing, and each of these ecosystem types are unique. And so I think some of the things that Michael was describing may be very effective in a wetter system, but in our dry, arid forests, just as Mary described, we'll need a combination.
Gidget's got a good question.
Yeah, Mary, you got a question from Jay Thibner. Have there been any studies on saguaro and other cactus mortality related to the Woodbury?
Not that I'm aware of specific to Woodbury, but there are a number of papers out there that talk about cactus mortality. The number that is stuck in my head to remember is that if you have 30 to 50% of a saguaro scorched, it's probably going to die. The skin of the saguaro is green, so it's photosynthetically active stuff that's the same as needles or leaves or whatever. That's how it combines light, water, carbohydrates, and whatever, and creates food and makes more material to grow. So when you scorch that, it's made up of little cells that have a lot of water in them. When it gets hot enough, those cells will break open as the water expands, and we see that as scorch when it turns brown. The cactus can't heal that at all, so it's going to have that brown scar for the rest of its life. So if you look at particularly a large saguaro cactus, and you scorch 40% of it, you just took away 40% of its ability to make food for itself. So it's probably going to starve over a long period of time. You see a lot of cacti right now, especially saguaros. They're easy to see, the big ones anyway, that are sort of in this half-dead state, unfortunately. If you're interested in some of the papers, send me an email. I've got a few of them, or you can dig them up on the web.
Good. I did put in your email, and you put your email to people to get in touch with you. I also put a link that you can do a short evaluation of the webinars that I put together. So I can enter that again. Mary, one of my concerns about those saguaros are the young saguaro that are probably down there growing with the grasses that I assume don't survive at all. What do you know?
I don't have any hard numbers on the young ones, but you're absolutely right. Some of the the stuff I've read, some of the research I've read talks about 80% mortality, but they're not specific about, you saw the variability in the fire type in those 2 videos I showed you. So when they say 80% though, I'm assuming that it includes both the large ones and the little ones that we never see because they're under their nurse plants.
Mm-hmm. Okay, Gazette asks, she says, great presentation, Mary. What are your thoughts on targeted grazing at the pre-emergent stage? So yeah, some of the management implications that you brought up at the end of your report, if you're able to report on some ideas that you have from what we've been seeing, that I think that would be interesting to discuss.
That's a discussion we've had on the forest on and off, and probably will continue to, because obviously if there was a way to knock these grasses down before they can get cured and carry fire, that might be helpful. There's a couple of considerations that really stick though. One is, when I've had this discussion with ranchers, actually, they're certainly interested in helping, but that would require that they can move all of their livestock around in dense enough numbers to really do a number on these areas. We don't have those areas currently fenced out, so it might involve additional fencing. That's additional disturbance and barriers on the landscape and so on. The barriers are important, not just for wildlife, but if you're gonna put a fence in, that's a concern for firefighters too, and anybody else who might get caught by a fire, and livestock. So there would be some fencing that would have to be done, some serious coordination and collaboration with ranchers or other folks. Some of them are certainly willing to talk about it, but I haven't heard of one yet, and this includes talking with our forest range program manager of how it could be functional in terms of them needing to move around hundreds at a minimum, hundreds of heads of livestock. That's one thing. And the other thing is then it's an ecological concern that there are these native ephemeral species which also need these years. And if we knock them all out by grazing or whatever means, it's going to do some damage to them. Sometimes, you know, that's the cost of doing business. Sometimes it's just a tough question. We don't know the answer to it.
Yeah.
I'd really be interested if anyone out there has any ideas on how that could be done. Maybe goats with solar panel electric fences or something. We did that in Nebraska on small areas. Remember, we have 800,000 acres of desert.
A lot. And they, okay, Drew asks, okay, one thing I wanted to say, it is past noon. If people need to go, please go ahead. We're going to go ahead and finish out these questions. And yeah, so thank you, Mary. We're doing great. We're fine on time. So Drew asks, are you aware of local or Central Arizona field research efforts focusing on red brome control?
I am not, Drew. Shout out to Drew too. If you've got any more ideas on this, we'd like to hear them. Drew is the supervisor's office wildlife biologist for the Tonto. I am not. I think red brome, unfortunately, has escaped some people's radars. There are some papers on it. Ryan's supposed to be looking for one for me right now on the schismus as well. I talked to the Rocky Mountain Research Station. I can't remember who exactly. One person here, Carolyn Hulsieg, and then I can't remember the person at the RMRS station up in Salt Lake City, trying to track down if they were having any success in biological controls for cheatgrass. And they had this thing for a while called the black fingers of death. It was a fungus that kind of fizzled. And then Tiger Rohrer, our fire management officer for the Tonto, had pointed me at some additional research that Salt Lake had been doing, looking at some compounds in the soil that they thought might be able to retard the growth of annual bromes, but it also fizzled. That didn't go anywhere.
Yeah, as I've been doing these webinars, I've had certain presenters on. I started with Cindy Salo, who did her dissertation in like 1990 on red brome in Arizona out of the University of Arizona. And she was kind of like, it's finally become an issue because she was looking at it so long ago. Another thing that was interesting that she brought up, that red brome has been in Arizona since 1950s. And so what has changed? What has allowed, I mean, I love the set of the rain pattern that you described and the way you did that as an average over 10 years and that rain pattern that we had in 2017, 2018 that led up to this. But that seed had to build up enough and I imagine it just blows in the wind. It can go right over hills. I don't know how it shows up. It's the vectors on the roads. But yeah, anything you know, I mean, this thing maybe just nobody knows.
I did some research into red brome a couple of years ago, and when I had a little more time, I would do these things called fire facts. Tried to do them every month, but I just ran out of time this year because we had so much fire on the Tonto. Anyway, in looking into that, it appears that red brome was first documented in California in 1848. And it was sown by ranchers into the Santa Rita Mountains down in Tucson in 1908, I think it was. And it's moved its way north. I think one of the things that I'm really curious about is the difference in the types of invasive grasses in northern and southern Arizona. In the southern part of the Sonoran down by Tucson, buffalo grass is a much bigger deal. That is a perennial, so it's there every year regardless. We are fortunate, believe it or not, at this point to have it be red brome and schismus, and there's some other things coming in like wild oats and stuff that we're just starting to see really be an issue in fountain grass. But it's an annual. So although it may be bad for 2 or 3 years at a time and do a lot of damage, unless we continue to have wet years, it will back off in those dry years and won't be as bad. That's not the case with buffalo grass. We have some of that, but currently it's not our biggest issue.
And it's just so episodic that when it happens, like this year, it is just overwhelming.
Yep.
Some other research they've been doing on cheatgrass is kind of what they call green striping or green stripping, and they're putting out a wheatgrass or some type of grass that they're able to use for a green fuel break, and they're able to use that to break up the spread of the cheatgrass and be able to contain the fires. And so you were showing the fuel break in the Chaparral. What are some of your thoughts about fuel breaks? I had a meeting another thing recently, and somebody brought up some type of retardants, something that you can put on the roadsides and it'll keep things from burning. I don't know much about that. I was kind of, yeah, it was new.
Well, so when you have these light grasses, we really haven't seen much that's going to slow them down. I'm looking over here. I might be able to share a quick video of what it looked like when the salt fire blew over Highway 188 in the previous year when the mountain fire was burning up in the Cave Creek district. Reports from the fire folks there, I wasn't there at the time, but those folks were telling me where, I forget exactly which street it was, but it's one of the roads down there near the district office that at that place was 4 or 5 lanes wide, and the fire blew over it like it wasn't even there because of the fine fuels.
If you get that up, just feel free to hit that green button for share screen.
Okay, let's see. Oh gosh, I've got so many videos in here. I think I've got it here.
So you need to bring it up from the share screen. So go to that green button.
Yeah, whoops, sorry, I'm forgetting. I've got so many screens here.
Yeah.
Oh, where's the share screen? It is right there.
There you go.
I don't know if you folks can see that. So that was the night that the salt fire was crossing Highway 188. Oh, shoot. I had a better one too. Well, I think you saw just a touch of that anyway, right?
Maybe start it over from the beginning.
I stopped for a little bit and then was talking with the IC and we drove through it together so I could get back up pace in that night. You can see over on the left there, the fire is already scooted quite a ways to the left side of the highway. But look at the speed of the embers and the smoke going over the highway up there. There's just not a lot you can do.
No. Get out of the way.
Yep.
Okay. Well, I'm not seeing more questions show up here, so we're gonna close this down. Let me bring up my closing slides. Here's Mary again. We saw that behind you. I noticed that's your cover page. Congratulations. I'm sure
Yeah,
that's another great story too.
that's a different story.
I've put in the chat box this link for the webinar evaluations. It takes less than a minute or so. Just what you learned here. Are you going to share it? Ideas for more webinars. So thank you so much for working on that. We've just finished our Q&A with Mary. Thank you. And just a heads up for next week, we'll be doing the 3rd annual Cobra Valley Watershed Forum. It starts Thursday at 9 a.m. There are 3-hour blocks. So from 9 to 12, we'll be holding our program, and then on Friday as well. And so at the beginning, I was just promoting it here, kind of our agenda. So if you're interested, or even if you're just able to join for portions of it, go ahead and register and please join us. So with that, thank you everybody. I'm going to hit stop record.